What if your fate is just your childhood, trying to finish what was never resolved? You think your choices are free, that the people you love, the pain you attract, are accidents, random chapters in some story called destiny. But what if that story isn't new? What if it was written in childhood, and you've been reciting it ever since? Freud didn't believe in fate. He believed in repetition, in patterns so deep they feel divine. But they're not divine, they're psychological. And you're not cursed. You're just reenacting something your unconscious refuses to let go. We don't repeat because we want to. We repeat because we don't know we're repeating. Freud called it the compulsion to repeat, an unconscious drive to recreate the same emotional conditions, especially those born in childhood, even if they once caused us pain. Especially if they did. You call it fate. You call it just how things are. But Freud would tell you, the compulsion to repeat is stronger than the pleasure principle. In other words, your mind doesn't care if it hurts. It cares if it feels familiar. So you end up in the same kind of relationship. You fall for people who feel oddly right, but drain you, ignore you, abandon you. Not because you deserve it, but because that's the kind of emotional weather your psyche learned to survive. You don't want that person. You want that atmosphere. Because some part of you still believes that if you can master that chaos this time, if you can win where you once lost, you'll finally heal. But that's not healing. That's rehearsal. The unconscious isn't subtle. It repeats the same pattern until you notice the script. Freud saw it in war veterans who returned to the battlefield, in children who played out traumatic scenes again and again, in adults who walked blindly into the same heartbreak, even when they swore they knew better. This is not weakness. It's the unconscious trying to resolve what the conscious cannot face. It's not fate. It's a closed circuit, and unless you disrupt it, it keeps spinning, with you inside it. So the question isn't, why does this keep happening to me? The question is, when will I stop calling this familiar pain destiny? You think you're making decisions, but often you're just following cues from a script you never wrote. Freud believed that the unconscious doesn't simply store memories, it reenacts them, silently, symbolically, relentlessly. It builds scenes around you. It assigns roles to the people you meet. It creates crises that look like life, but are actually unresolved emotions in costume. You believe you're falling in love. Maybe, or maybe you're just re-entering the same emotional climate you were raised in, hoping that this time it ends differently. This is the unconscious at work, not as a theory, but as a director. Invisible, tireless, and methodical. Freud observed this in his clinical work. Patients would unconsciously repeat the emotional dynamics of their childhood, but with new people, new faces, new scenes. A woman with an absent father would seek men who disappear. A man humiliated as a child would unconsciously attract situations of public shame. And all of them would swear, "I didn't see it coming." Of course they didn't, because the unconscious doesn't ask for permission, it asks for repetition. In the unconscious, time does not exist. Freud wrote this to remind us, what hurt you at 5 can still control you at 35. Not because it's still happening, but because your psyche hasn't learned that it's over. So the unconscious keeps setting the stage, similar dynamics, different costumes. You think, why does this person treat me like this? But the better question is, why does this feel so familiar? Because what you're really responding to isn't the present moment. It's the emotional shadow of the past. And here's where it becomes dangerous. The unconscious doesn't seek happiness. It seeks familiarity. Even if that familiarity is toxic, even if it recreates suffering. And the more you deny this, the more convincing the theater becomes. You'll say things like, "I always attract narcissists. Every boss I have ends up disrespecting me. No one ever sees me." But what you're really saying is, "I keep playing the same role, hoping the audience changes." They won't, because your unconscious is not trying to change the ending. It's trying to finish a feeling. That feeling you couldn't express as a child. That wound you had no words for. That need that went unmet, unnoticed, unspoken. This is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Because as long as you keep mistaking the stage for the world, you'll keep reacting to actors instead of understanding the play. Freud's work teaches us something deeply unsettling. What we call reality is often an emotional projection, designed not to liberate us, but to bind us to what we never resolved. Until we see it, until we step off the stage and into awareness. You say you want peace, but you keep knocking on doors that only know how to slam. What if the pain isn't chasing you? You're the one returning to it. No, not consciously, not logically, but deeply, repetitively, faithfully. Because pain, your pain, is the only thing that still knows your name. You say, "I just want something real." But you walk into the same illusions built from the same blueprint. Childhood rewritten as adulthood. Let's stop pretending. This isn't about love. This is about repetition. You're not trying to be happy. You're trying to win the same battle where you once lost as a child. Different players, same terrain. What Freud understood, and most of us refuse to admit, is this. The unconscious doesn't want resolution. It wants repetition until you finally feel what you couldn't back then. Not heal, feel. The sadness, the rage, the betrayal you swallowed when you still believed they'd come back. That moment you stopped being a child and started being whatever they needed. So now you say yes too easily. You forgive before there's remorse. You stay where you're not seen, because being seen feels unfamiliar and therefore unsafe. That's not love. That's conditioning. Let me ask you something brutal. Are you sure you want to heal? Or are you secretly hoping that this time they'll regret losing you? Because if your healing is still about being seen by them, you're still serving the wound, not yourself.
Freud didn't talk about empowerment. He talked about truth. And here's one. Most of what you think is love is just the nervous system searching for closure, not partnership. Closure. You don't want new love. You want the same story with a new ending. But that ending isn't coming. Not if you keep playing your part so well. So what now? You have two choices. 1, keep calling it fate. 2, or realize you've been auditioning for the same role in the same play your whole life. And maybe healing begins the moment you realize you were never meant to be part of that script. You don't fall in love with people. You fall in love with patterns. The tone of their voice, the way they pull away, the silence they weaponize, the validation they offer, just enough to keep you starving. It feels familiar because it is. This is the emotional déjà vu no one talks about. When someone hurts you in the same way you've always been hurt, and you confuse that pain for connection. Let's stop pretending you don't know what's happening. You do. You feel it in your chest, that tightening, that childlike alertness, that hope. Maybe this one is different. Maybe this time I won't have to beg for love. Maybe I'll finally be enough without having to suffer first. But it's never different, because you're not chasing love, you're chasing resolution. Freud saw this too clearly. We don't just transfer emotions, we transfer wounds. We unconsciously seek the same emotional architecture so we can try to repair it. But here's the paradox. You're trying to heal inside the wound. You want the very thing that broke you to become the thing that saves you. That's not healing. That's emotional captivity. So you end up in relationships where your silence is mistaken for strength, where your boundaries are treated as threats, where you overfunction, overgive, overexplain, and still get abandoned. Not because you're broken, but because you're running the same emotional software written by the first people who misunderstood you. Let me ask you something that might hurt. What if love, the way you've learned to feel it, is just emotional labor dressed up as destiny? You think you're loving deeply, but maybe you're just performing calmness to avoid conflict, performing understanding to avoid abandonment, performing resilience to hide the fact that you're tired of being the strong one. What if your version of love is just a defense mechanism in disguise? You say, I just want to feel safe. But when someone actually offers safety, you push them away. You say they're too nice or not exciting. But what you mean is, they don't activate my wound. And if my wound isn't activated, I don't know who I am. That's not romance. That's trauma bonding. The truth? You don't love them. You love the opportunity to finally win the same war that left you bleeding the first time. And until you see that, you'll keep mistaking suffering for depth and chaos for passion. So stop asking, why do I always attract the wrong people? And start asking, why does my nervous system only recognize love when it feels like pain?
You think you're kind, that you're understanding, empathetic, forgiving, that you see the good in people. But here's a truth no one told you. Half the time, what you call kindness is just fear in costume. You're not being gentle, you're being avoidant. You're not choosing peace, you're avoiding conflict because deep down, you're terrified that one honest boundary might make them leave. This isn't kindness, this is self-erasure. Freud would call it repetition through adaptation. You shape yourself to be pleasing, soft, non-threatening, not out of love, but because you once learned that being too much meant being left. So you shrink, you overgive, you anticipate needs before they're spoken, you apologize for things you didn't do. And they say, you're so easy to be around. Of course you are. You've made yourself small enough to never disturb the room. But here's what it costs. You become resentful, exhausted, invisible, and worst of all, you start to believe that your real self is a threat to love. Let that settle. If I'm quiet enough, they'll stay. If I don't complain, I'll be chosen. If I'm useful, they won't leave. Do you hear it now? That's not maturity. That's trauma management. You're not at peace, you're surviving. You're not low maintenance, you're emotionally underfed. And you keep calling it love because the wound feels familiar. Let me be blunt. Self-abandonment is not a virtue. It's a wound with manners. And the more you perform it, the more they'll love a version of you that doesn't exist. A version that never says no, never needs anything, never breaks. But you do break, just silently, alone, when no one's watching, when being so understanding starts to feel like being hollow. So let me ask you, who taught you that being loved meant being quiet, agreeable, and selfless? And when did you decide that disappearing was the only way to belong? Freud would say this: in other words, you have to reclaim the parts of you you pushed into the dark just to be acceptable. Because here's the deepest wound of all. You keep choosing people who need your silence because you're afraid of what will happen if you finally make a sound. But real healing? It's not about becoming more lovable. It's about becoming more you, even if that you is loud, angry, inconvenient, or unapologetically alive. You can convince your mind of anything. You can read books, understand your trauma, repeat affirmations, do the work. Tell yourself, I'm safe now. I've moved on. It's different this time. But your body knows better. Because your nervous system doesn't speak English. It speaks tension. It speaks heart rate. It speaks withdrawal, hypervigilance, numbness. And no matter how smart you are, your body will react before your brain catches up. Freud didn't ignore the body. He saw it as the stage where the unconscious reveals itself without restraint. Symptoms, he wrote, are the return of the repressed. You thought the trauma was buried? It never was. It was stored in muscle, in posture, in breath, waiting.
That tightness in your chest when someone raises their voice. That urge to please when someone seems distant. That sudden silence when conflict shows up. That's not personality. That's programming. I freeze because I don't want to make it worse. I dissociate because I learned it's safer not to feel. I overreact because no one ever explained how to process emotion. You didn't choose this, but now it's yours to untangle. The body doesn't lie. It keeps score. And if you want to know what still hurts, stop asking your mind. Start listening to your chest, your stomach, your jaw. Where do you go when you feel unsafe? Into anger? Into appeasement? Into compliance or collapse? That's your nervous system trying to protect you with old instructions. And unless you update the system, it will keep reacting to the present as if it's still 1997 or 1984 or whatever year it was when the wound first entered. You say you're tired, but it's not just emotional. It's physiological. Exhaustion from years of over-regulating your reactions so others wouldn't leave. That's why the healing doesn't come just from understanding. It comes from regulation, from safety, from letting your body unlearn what it was forced to master too soon. You think you're over it? Then why does your body still flinch when someone speaks in the same tone as your father once did? Why do your shoulders rise when someone questions your worth? Why do you still apologize when you've done nothing wrong? Because logic doesn't overwrite the unconscious. And healing isn't about explaining, it's about releasing. The ego is not master in its own house, Freud said. Your conscious mind is a guest in a home run by fear, memory, and defense. And until you listen to the walls, the creaks, the pulses, the echoes, you'll keep wondering why the same ghosts knock on your door. You think you're in control, that you make choices, that you know better now. But if you look closely, you'll notice something uncomfortable. You keep choosing what hurts you, and then calling it fate. The truth? You don't choose. Your unconscious does. And it chooses what's familiar, not what's good. Freud knew this long before we had words like attachment wounds or trauma bonds. He called it repetition compulsion. A blind urge to recreate the very dynamics that caused us pain, because pain feels like home when that's all you've ever known. So you go back
to people who invalidate you, to jobs that drain you, to environments that reduce you. Why? Because at least you understand how to survive in those places. You don't need a map. You've been there before. Let's be honest. Sometimes it's not healing you want, it's predictability. You'd rather be hurt in a way you recognize than be loved in a way that feels foreign. You say you're done, but you still check their profile, still reply when they message at 2 a.m., still feel that sting when they ignore you. Why? Because your mind broke up, but your nervous system is still married. This is the illusion of control. You think you're making choices, but really you're obeying a script you didn't write. One where you chase validation because love was once earned. One where you overperform because being seen used to come with a price. One where leaving feels like betrayal, even when staying feels like slow death.
Freud didn't sugarcoat it. Most people do not really want freedom because freedom involves responsibility, and most people are frightened of responsibility. Responsibility for what? For breaking the cycle, for becoming aware, for choosing what's unfamiliar but healthy. Because real love, real peace, they don't activate your old patterns, they confuse them. And confusion feels unsafe to someone who has lived in hypervigilance their whole life. So here's the paradox. The healthier it is, the less chemistry you feel. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't match the chaos you were trained to crave. That's not intuition, that's programming. You say, I just want to feel normal, but what's normal to you is dysfunction, delayed needs, emotional scarcity. That's the blueprint. And the unconscious, it doesn't deviate from the blueprint until you burn it. So the question is, are you brave enough to stop choosing what feels right and start choosing what feels unfamiliar but safe? Because control isn't power, awareness is. And until you stop obeying what's familiar, you'll keep calling your trauma a preference. You think silence means defeat, that if you stop explaining, defending, proving, you've lost, that if you don't fight back, they win. But here's a deeper truth. Silence is not the absence of power. It is what remains when you stop handing your power away. You've spent years trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You've wasted your voice on rooms that echo nothing back. And each time you speak louder, bend further, explain more, you shrink a little inside. But what if silence isn't giving up? What if it's stepping out? Out of the theater, out of the script, out of the repetition. Freud didn't speak much of silence, but his entire framework points to it. That which is unconscious rules us until we confront it or withdraw from its game. And silence, true silence, is confrontation by absence. It is the refusal to feed the same dynamic one more time. It says, I no longer argue with ghosts. I no longer explain myself to patterns. I no longer negotiate with the part of me that would rather be chosen than free. Let me ask you, what if your power was never in being heard, but in being unavailable to what harms you? Silence breaks the loop, not the silence of fear, but the silence of clarity. You don't ghost them, you ghost the version of yourself that kept showing up just to be wounded again. It's uncomfortable at first, because the ego wants to speak, to prove it's right, to be seen one last time. But healing doesn't need an audience. It needs withdrawal from roles, from performance, from the belief that if you just explain yourself better, you'll finally be loved right. You won't, because the kind of love you're still chasing only exists in memory, not reality.
So you stop, not because you're weak, but because you're done. Done negotiating, done explaining your worth, done auditioning for peace. The silence you're afraid of? That's the doorway. Not the end, the beginning. Because the moment you stop responding to old patterns, familiar chaos, inherited roles, you create space.
And in that space, your voice returns. But not the voice of survival, the voice of sovereignty. So the next time you're asked to explain yourself to someone who only listens to their own projections, don't. Say nothing. Not out of defeat, but because sometimes the loudest thing you can say is, "This version of me no longer performs for pain." Where it was, ego shall be. You keep asking, "What's wrong with me? Why do I keep sabotaging myself? Why can't I just be normal?" But what if the answer is this? Nothing is wrong with you. You just haven't met the parts of you that had to go quiet so you could stay loved. Freud taught that when a conflict between instinct and survival is too great, the psyche splits. We repress, we bury. Not because we're broken, but because we needed to remain connected to people who couldn't love all of us. So you buried your anger, your grief, your intuition, your voice, and built a self that was acceptable, smiling, helpful, low maintenance, forgiving, always. You became easy to love by becoming hard to see. That's not healing, that's exile. And now you call this exile personality. You say things like, "I'm just not confrontational. I'm easygoing. I don't need much." But underneath that modesty is a graveyard of things you never allowed yourself to feel. Your sadness isn't weakness, it's memory. Your anxiety isn't madness, it's the body screaming, "We've abandoned something important." Let me say something that might burn. You didn't lose yourself. You left yourself on purpose, to be loved, to be safe, to survive. But survival is not the same as living. And now you're old enough, strong enough to go back, to dig through the silence, to recover the voice, to sit with the parts of you that were locked away, not because they were bad, but because they were real. That's what the unconscious protects, the real you, the raw, unsanitized, unapologetic self who once screamed and wasn't heard, so it stopped screaming. Freud didn't say healing is about fixing. He said it's about remembering. Remembering to bring the lost parts back into the whole. Where it was, ego shall be. Meaning, bring light to where there was only reaction. Bring presence to what was once automatic. Bring love to the parts that never got any. So when you say, "I don't know who I am anymore," you're not lost. You're on the edge of resurrection. And the real you, the one you buried to be accepted, isn't gone. It's waiting for you, not to explain, not to apologize, but to return. You finally see it. The pattern, the loop, the lie you've been living, and it hurts like hell. You thought awareness would feel like peace, like clarity, but instead it feels like betrayal, like mourning, because now you know. You handed your heart to people who couldn't hold it. You twisted yourself into roles just to be chosen. You sacrificed your truth for crumbs of connection. That doesn't feel like healing. It feels like grief. Freud never said awareness would feel good. He said it would feel real. And reality, at first, always wounds. Because when the veil lifts, you don't just see others differently. You see yourself. Your compliance, your silence, your desperation dressed up as compassion. Awareness is not liberation. It's invitation to choose differently, to suffer consciously instead of blindly. It's the moment you realize, I was never the victim I thought I was. I was a participant in a pattern I didn't understand. And that hurts, because now there's no one left to blame, not fully. Your parents, your partners, they played their part, but so did you. You stayed, you performed, you made yourself digestible when all you ever wanted was to be known. So what now? You sit with it, with the shame, the rage, the tenderness you buried. You stop calling it overreacting when it's actually just remembering. You stop saying, it's not that bad, when your body's been screaming for years. You stop using healing as performance and let it be raw, ugly, private. Freud wrote that the unconscious doesn't forget, it waits until you're ready, not to fix, but to face. And now you're facing it. The past, the false peace, the fake smiles, the noise you used to drown out the silence of your own voice. Awareness doesn't end the pain, it ends the loop, so the pain finally has somewhere to go. It becomes movement, energy, choice. And from that choice, something new emerges. Not the old self restored, but the buried self remembered. The one that knows, I don't have to explain this anymore. I just have to honor it. So if it hurts right now, good. That means it's working. That means you're not numb. That means you've stepped off the wheel and onto the ground. And yes, it's uneven, uncertain, even cruel sometimes. But it's yours. And finally, so are you. You spent your life asking, why does this keep happening to me? Wrong question. Because it was never happening to you. It was happening through you. You weren't just in the pattern. You were the pattern. The repetition, the echo, the unfinished sentence your childhood kept trying to complete. Freud didn't believe in fate. He believed in compulsion. And now you see why. It wasn't destiny. It was you, responding with the same nervous system, the same expectations, the same survival code in every new situation. You were chasing healing, but reenacting wounding, looking for love, but repeating abandonment, begging to be seen, but hiding who you truly were. Why can't I move forward? Because you've been trying to walk away while dragging the entire play with you. Same role, different actors, same script. But here's the shift. You're not inside the loop anymore. You're watching it. And from here, you can decide. You don't need closure. You don't need revenge. You don't need them to understand. You don't even need to be healed in the way you imagined. You just need to stop auditioning for a role that ends in pain every single time. Let them say you've changed. Let them say you're distant. Let them say you're not who you used to be. They're right.
Because the old you was a ghost, haunting their own story for a different ending. But now you leave the stage, quietly. No monologue, no applause, no need to explain. You simply stop performing. Because the loop can only continue if you keep saying your lines. So let it echo. Let the silence be misunderstood. Let the old dynamic collapse without your presence to hold it up. You're not cruel. You're not punishing. You're just done. And in that stillness, something sacred returns. A you before the pattern, before the pleasing, before the performing. A you that never needed to be chosen, because you were never supposed to be offered as a sacrifice to be loved. So now, ask again, why does this keep happening to me? And this time, answer, because I kept calling my own reflection fate. Not anymore. Now you walk, not away from them, but back to yourself. If the script was never yours, then who were you before the story began?